In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus, repletuorum cosa viderium, et tui amoris in ne sine macende, emite Spiritum tuum creabuntur.
Et renovabis spatium terrae.
Oremus, Deus qui quod viderium Sancti Spiritus, illustrationem docuvisti, da nobis in eodem Spiritu recte sapere, et Deus in gratia regal Dei per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Comore Immaculatum,
Ora pro nobis.
Sancti Joseph,
Ora pro nobis.
Santa Teresia,
Ora pro
in
nobis.
nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, we continue the liturgical movement that started off well. Believe it or not, just there's a monk from Solem, the abbot there, modernist today, just came out recently saying Pope Leo should make one missal with the two rites in the missal. Tridentine rite and Novus Ordo rite. So they want to equate the two as two equal rites, which is what has Christ to do with Baal, says St. Paul. You cannot drink of the chalice of Christ and drink of the chalice of devils. You just can't.
He also says a kingdom divided against itself shall not stand.
Yeah. Yes. And that's the new trend, is everybody there's a place for everybody in the new church. All rights, but no exclusivity. That's the one thing they can't stand, is exclusivity. Is Christ exclusive?
Yes.
How does he show it?
By saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me.
Yeah, that's exclusive. Who gathers not with me.
Scatters.
Yes. If we join the dots, the full picture emerges. There is a general reluctance among traditionalists to acknowledge that the liturgical reforms of Pius XII are part of a continuum. From the inception of the liturgical movement in what year?
1909.
Yeah, really early. And this is right under the pontificate of Pius X. At the Benedictine Abbey of Montcésar, of the creation of the Novus Ordo 60 years later, yet these were the words of Paul VI when he promulgated the new Mass on April 3rd, 1969. So we saw this. He quotes praising Pius XII as kicking off this the first stages of the reform, which would end up with the new Mass. It is not without significance that a future abbot primate of the Benedictine order, Dom Rambert Wickland, who inherited the avant-garde ideas of Baudouin's liturgical movement, would be one of Paul VI's personal consultors with regard to the Novus Ordo. In his memoirs, Wickland explained how he was a protege of Bugnini, who assured him of Pope Paul's high regard for him. This demonstrates that the official reforms of Pius XII, no less than those of Paul VI, were tarred with the same brush, tainted from their Benedictine source. It follows that Pacelli and Montini must bear the ultimate responsibility, each in his own way, for the unprecedented changes in the Roman Rite that they signed into law. Pius XII allowed liturgical anarchy to reign. Michael?
In the early part of the 20th century, unauthorized liturgical experimentation was conducted in secret among a select few in the crypt of Maria Laach Abbey, at monastic retreats, in university chaplaincies, and societies of youth groups, among soldiers on active duty during World War I, on seafaring missions, and among radical groups such as Catholic Worker. Subversive ideas were spread in samizdat publications distributed from hand to hand or by word of mouth in small-scale conferences, held behind closed doors. However, by 1940, the movement gradually spread into parishes with the open or tacit approval of bishops around the world, who were won over in increasing numbers to the new ideas. But what about Pius XII's criticism in Mediator Dei of liturgical abuses and the faulty theology that inspired them? As these mildly expressed rebukes did not reveal a resolve to deal appropriately with the offenders who either ignored or denied them, they were taken to be a display of weakness, as if to say the Church did not take too seriously her own liturgical laws. Mediator Dei thus sent a clear signal of supine capitulation.
That means to give in to.
And further, an innovation to sidestep the system. Bugnini would later boast that the incredible success of the reformers vindicated the adage that fortune favors the brave. The ease with which the reformers could get away with breaking law was a huge incentive behind the liturgical movement. The absence of tough-minded measures against the dissidents. It became clear to them that the possibility of a far more drastic reform of the liturgy was being opened up under Pius XII than had hitherto been dreamed of. In fact, the 10 years following Mediator Dei saw the Pope steadily succumbing to their demands and entrenching some of their reforms in the Church's liturgy. They would soon gain everything they had been fighting for, and much more besides, after Vatican II. It was Pius XII's profound ambivalence that made effective control of the liturgical movement impossible. Whose side was he really on? Opposing factions claimed victory, but the claim for the traditionalist party ran hollow when they found themselves abandoned to the tender mercies of Bugnini, who was given an influential position on the 1948 Commission for the general reform of the liturgy by none other than Pius XII himself. Before dealing with the actual changes to the Holy Week liturgy in 1955, which were many and significant under Pius XII, we will take a look at the guiding principles of the 1948 Commission for the general reform of the liturgy, and the manner in which its secretary, Bugnini,
in the manner
in which its secretary, Bugnini, went about his task of organizing the destruction of the Church's most ancient and venerable ceremonies.
Yeah, so under Pius XII, they were very busy and gaining a lot of ground. Who would ever believed it? Who would ever suspected this? Secrecy paramount, ethics thrown to the winds. Anthony, loud and clear.
Bugnini's penchant for secrecy informed all his actions. As we have seen, he had been making clandestine visits to the Centre de Pastorale Liturgique since 1946.
Center of Liturgical Pastoral. What would that be? Pastoral Liturgy. Center of Pastoral Liturgy since 1946.
The year in which Pius XII requested Cardinal Salati, the prefect of the Congregation of Rites, to begin forming a project for the general reform of the liturgy. Bugnini himself stated that his commission met, quote-unquote, in absolute secrecy. He transmitted selective information via Father Bea and Monsignor Montini, up the back stairs, so to speak, to the Pope during the latter's illness, kept the Sacred Congregation of Rites in the dark, and sprang the first of the Holy Week reforms on the unsuspecting faithful in 1951. In fact, so secret was the work of the commission that Bugnini admitted that, quote-unquote, the publication of the renewed order for Holy Saturday at the beginning of March 1951 caught even the officials of the Congregation of Rites by surprise. The reason for his astonishing candor was, unfortunately, that he regarded his scheming not as something of which to be ashamed, but to boast about. If even the congregation knew nothing of the projected Easter Vigil reform, until it was formally proclaimed, one wonders at the integrity of Cardinal Macera, who was simultaneously president of Bugnini's commission and pro-prefect of the Congregation of Rites. In fact, it was Macera who signed the decree publishing the new Order of Holy Saturday. This raises the question of collusion with Bugnini and whether the Easter Vigil reform had been, as it were, stitched up between them. Where would that leave Pius XII, in whose name the reform was issued? It is, however, no secret that Bugnini, not the Pope, was in permanent control of the commission.
Yes, so Bugnini was no doubt a Freemason, and he's used to working in the dark, working secretly, and that's what they were up to. I am the liturgical reform. Gabriel?
These words of inflated self-esteem were attributed to Bugnini by a close colleague.
Footnote, apud Ansgar Chapunko. What then is liturgy? Musings in memoir. Father Chapungo, former president of the Pontifical Liturgical Institute in Rome and avid defender of the reforms, recalled that Bugnini spoke these words during one of his visits to the Institute. That's like, what's his name? Fauci. I am science. What did he say? Something about, remember? He came out saying,
Sounds familiar, but I forget.
yeah, they were claiming that all these shots were part of the science. Follow the science. And he came out saying, I am the science. So these guys get so filled with themselves, it's not even funny.
And it also reminds me of when Pope Francis said Vatican II is the magisterium. Pope Francis.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, well, he knows now. Can you drop that to 3 inches? Go on.
Whether or not Bugnini actually said that, he had no difficulty in fulfilling this absolutist role. His ability to create ecclesiastical policy in secret and have it later imposed on the universal church is more akin to what we would expect of a totalitarian state. It is also an example of the corrupting power handed to him by Pius XII. Without such papal backing, the work of the commission would have ground to a halt. However, having the power of the Pope behind it, Bugnini's commission became an end in itself, unchangeable and unquestionable.
Unchallengeable.
Unchallengeable and unquestionable. The ultimate
Bureaucratic.
bureaucratic weapon against all objectors. It would grow into a global, powerful, and unaccountable industry, forcing the world's bishops willy-nilly to toe the Bugnini line.
You don't know the expression willy-nilly?
No.
How does it define? So, what does this tell you about Bugnini?
He had a lot of power.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's
He had a lot of free reign.
power struck.
And he wouldn't have had it unless who gave it to him? So that's a real mystery, isn't it? Willy-nilly is an adverb or adjective meaning disorganized, haphazard, or without planning. Willy-nilly. Never heard that word? No. So, forcing the world's bishops, haphazardly, willy-nilly, to toe the Bugnini line. And Archbishop Lefebvre even describes one of the, right towards the end of the council, Bugnini is doing a kind of a expose of the new Mass. And he's showing them how it's going to be done. And you have all these venerable prelates there, bishops, and Archbishop Lefebvre was among them. And they're just watching this young Bugnini explaining them how the church is going to say Mass from now on. And they were all like struck with, who is this pigeon telling us how we're going to say Mass? Who is this clown who's overthrowing all the venerable rights of the Catholic Church. And they were all just like, well, the Pope gave him power. The Pope gave him permission. The Pope gave him power. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. And Archbishop Lefebvre makes the point that the venerable Dom Sorte, Gabriel Sorte, who was a chaplain in World War I, abbot of a monastery, he raised his hand and said, well, how do you have, when you have private masses in the monastery and there's no faithful there, how does that work? And Bugnini, you know what he said?
Is that, oh, we didn't think about that.
Yeah, we didn't think about that one. I mean, and here they are meeting at cafes, secret meetings, to overthrow the church's venerable, sacred, canonized right. And this pigeon is just... The bishops couldn't believe he had such power. And I think Bishop Lefebvre said, you know, there'd be cardinals waiting, you know, hours to talk to the Pope. He would walk right by them and go right into the Pope's office. Bugnini. So he had this strange power over Pius XII. I can't explain it. Divisive reforms. It is not generally appreciated just how controversial the 1951-55 Holy Week reforms were in their day. Historical records exist to show that they were vehemently criticized by many bishops, priests, and lay people on account of the radical nature of the changes then initiated. So this, if you can attack and change Holy Week, especially Good Friday, everything else is easy. Among the most outspoken critics was Monsignor Léon Gromier. Okay, remember this hero. Monsignor Léon Gromier. Remember his name. Monsignor Léon Gromier. He was one of the few to see what was really going on. So he was one of the outspoken critics. He was a distinguished prelate of the papal household and a canon of St. Peter's Basilica. The canons chant the Divine Office in St. Peter's. That's what they do. They chant the Divine Office. As a consultor to the Congregation of Rites since the time of Pope Pius X. So here he is, a venerable, old Monsignor who's been around the block. And he was there under Pius X. He would have known Cardinal Meridoval. He would have been totally behind Pascendi and Lamentabili, condemning the modernists, cleaning them out. And he was a respected author of works on liturgical ceremonial. He was in a position to speak with authority on the Holy Week ceremonies. His knowledge was legendary on all subjects liturgical, from Buja to buskins and fabulas to faldstools. So he knew all about Buja is the candle you hold for a bishop. Buskins, I don't know what that is. Fabulas, I don't know what that. Faldstool is where the priest sits here in the sedilla. That's the shape of a faldstool. And it's normally used for a bishop when he goes to the altar to bestow minor orders or major orders. So this made him the strongest of advocates for arguing the case for the traditional rites, R-I-T-E-S. Monsignor Gromier, who had been publicly criticizing the liturgical movement since 1936, gave a conference in Paris in 1960. So he knew something was going on with these rats, right? A monthly journal edited by a French priest called Opus Dei, nothing to do with the criminal group of priests. Father Ferdinand Portier, who was known for his arrangement and promotion of Gregorian chants. Anyway, in which he excoriated the 1955 Holy Week reforms. So in this conference in Paris, he just roasted the 55 new reforms. He didn't like them at all. Exposing the false liturgical science and the false reasoning behind them. He did not hesitate to describe them as an act of vandalism, quote, an immense loss and an outrage to history, the negation of reasoned principles, and the product of a pastoral mentality impregnated with a populist attitude unfavorable to the clergy. With reference to the liturgists who produced the reforms, he lamented that their, quote, discretionary powers are vast, as are the abuses. So he was not happy with Bugnini and that bag of rats. Objections from bishops to the interim Holy Week changes of 1951 poured into the Vatican. And here's another footnote. These included Monsignor Felice Bonomini, Bishop of Como, Cardinal Siri, Archbishop of Genoa, and Monsignor Cornelio Cucciarolo, Archbishop of Otranto. Abud Alcuin Reed, the Organic Ignatius Press, 2005. So these were many bishops objecting to the new Holy Week of 1951 to 55. The final and obligatory reform of 1955 was vigorously opposed by more bishops. For instance, Cardinal Spellman of New York. That's surprising, isn't it? He didn't like the new changes either, of 55. And Archbishop McQuaid of Dublin in Ireland, on the grounds that it might destabilize the faith of the Irish people. Yeah, so some of these bishops and cardinals understood. Don't play with what's stable and good. Don't put an imbalance. Among the laity, the Catholic newspapers, footnote, the Catholic Herald and the Tablet I think was out of England, of 1955 to 56 were rife with objections from the faithful. The novelist Evelyn Waugh, who had converted to Catholicism, considered the changes ruinous to his spiritual life and a danger to the faith itself, particularly among the simple folk. Isn't that interesting? You ever heard of Evelyn Waugh?
I think I have.
He wrote numerous literary works. Footnote, writing in The Spectator in 1962, Evelyn Waugh stated, during the last few years, we have experienced the triumph of the liturgists in the new arrangement of the services for the end of Holy Week and for Easter. For centuries, these had been enriched by devotions which were dear to the laity, the anticipation of the morning office of Tenebrae, the vigil of the altar of repose, the Mass of the pre-sanctified. It was not how the Christians of the 2nd century observed the season. It was the organic growth of the needs of the people. So, Evelyn Waugh. No leeway for traditional rites, but disregarding warnings about the consequences of changing long-established patterns of worship, that the new rites would endanger the habitual ingrained attitudes to the faith of devout Catholics. Pius XII issued his new liturgical laws and instructions in Maxima Redemptionis in 1955, and made the traditional rites illegal. Quote, those who follow the Roman rite are bound in the future to follow the restored Ordo for Holy Week. This new Ordo must be followed. Sacred Congregation of Rites, General Decree of Instruction, Maxima Redemptionis, November 16, 1955. So someone might object here and say, well, so why don't you do the 55 Holy Week then? Because the Pope has ordered this. Well, we could argue it's a disciplinary liturgical question, truly. And Pope Francis allowed it. He allowed it for St. Peter's, Christ the King Institute, and many indults to use the pre-55. So if they want to argue on that level, we have it.
Could you also argue that the Pope doesn't have the authority to undo something a Pope already did? So like quo primum, saying that you can't, like he's kind of going against that, which he doesn't. He's acting out of his authority there, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Yeah, he should have really respected Pius X too, because Pius All these popes, no one dared to change these things. But Bugnini, ooh, he must have been a weasel. A tragedy for traditionally minded bishops. Michael?
Pius XII used legislation to introduce arbitrary and unnecessary changes devised by revolutionaries. This put the law-abiding bishops, who placed obedience to the Pope as their foremost duty, into an untenable position. They were thus maneuvered into implementing the reforms that they objected to on grounds of the faith. In other words, giving them no choice but to comply, he pressured them to act against their principles and their consciences. And because Maxima Redemptionis legitimated the actions of dissident clergy who had been implementing the reforms without the Pope's authority for decades, it was a document fundamentally biased against the traditional rites.
Interesting. Now, in maybe some defense of Pius XII, maybe, in 1955, he would be dead in 3 years. So in his last 5 years, he was already ailing. So how much was actually his own work? How much was Bugnini coming in? Here, you got to sign this, sign all this, don't forget this. And the deadly one, oh, by the way, before I leave, please sign this one too. And the last one probably being, pushing all his nonsense. So maybe to give a little bit of benefit of the doubt to Pius XII. I mean, when you're sick, you don't feel well, you're not thinking always straight. Anyway, that's what happened. Go on.
The suppression and dissertation of inconvenient facts. Naturally, no mention was made in the decree of many bishops who considered the reforms to be pastorally unsound. The claim that the Holy Week reforms were attended by, quote, the greatest successes everywhere, end quote, is highly
Tendentious.
As such, it has no place in the ecclesiastical decree intended to bind the faithful. Yet, it was used to silence objections not only from traditionally minded bishops, but also from those Catholics who were attached to their traditions and had never requested or welcomed such changes. In short, the 1955 Holy Week reform, whatever the degree of Pius XII's complicity in it, was a papally backed mechanism for reordering the liturgy to incorporate the basic wishes of the reformers and to begin implementing their ideas for future changes. That is how the will of Bugnini's commission triumphed, and thus inescapably stifled opposition.
Okay, here's a little example. On Good Friday, the hymn "Christ to Christ the King," Vexilla Regis, it's so beautiful. The priest, when he brings the Blessed Sacrament from the altar of repose to the main altar on Good Friday, the hymn for centuries was always Vexilla Regis, to Christ the King. That was dropped because they hate Christ the King. The Novus Ordo Vatican II hates Christ the King. And then the incensation for his funeral. And then only the priest receives communion on Good Friday, traditionally. And now they give communion to everybody in the 55. But in the stripping of the altar, which is Holy Thursday, after the bringing the Blessed Sacrament to the altar of repose, which for us will be up in the loft upstairs, the priest is to strip the entire altar. Everything. So when they strip the entire altar, it looks like a table. With gradines and stuff, but it's stripped. While in the pre-55, you don't strip everything. It's not left looking like a table. There's the crucifix and 6 altars that are left. So it still looks like an altar. Right? Now you might say, well, big deal. But you can see in the 55 reforms, the introduction to the Novus Ordo, getting people used to seeing a bare altar, getting used to see the priest facing the people with a table in front of him on Holy Saturday. Because I know, because I did, for most of my priesthood, I did these 55 reforms, because the Archbishop chose to settle with that. But now that I've gone to the pre-55, I can see very clearly throughout the many details where they're introducing the new Mass, preparing it in the minds of the people, such as praying the Our Father together in English, right in the middle of the ceremony on Holy Saturday. And another one is the first time the priest facing the congregation with a cope extending his hands like this. He never did that before, So a lot of little subtle changes that are introduced to bring in the new Mass. You can see it, And then dropping the triptych candle was a terrible crime. Yes?
And according to the 55 changes, the priest also faced the people on Palm Sunday, right, Father? For the blessing of the palms?
Yes, that's right, with the table in front of him. Yeah, thank you. That's correct. That's another. So twice he's facing the people with the table in front. Yes.
Well, the saying the Our Father with the congregation, would you say that was the first time where it was in the rubrics that the priest was going to pray with the faithful, or the faithful had to pray along?
Yeah. Yeah, it was radical. And this is why Monsignor Gromier and even Cardinal Spellman, believe that, I'm surprised, but even Cardinal Spellman didn't like it. Because it smacked of Lutheranism, Protestantism, assemblyism. So, but, again, in defense of Archbishop Lefebvre's position, one cannot say that any of these things were openly heretical, or openly attacking the faith. And that's why the Archbishop, and most of the bishops said, okay, well, the Pope approves it, we'll go along. Even though many of them probably didn't like it. Some of them were probably really excited because they knew, finally, we're getting to a Mass that can get at the level of the people. And they'd be all behind the new Mass. So where do we leave off here?
A common thread.
Go on, Michael, you were reading?
Yes.
Go on.
With Mediator Dei of 1947, Pius XII had set the stage for active participation of the laity. Not only did he strongly encourage the dialogue Mass and congregational singing in this encyclical, but he also exhorted the bishops to set up diocesan committees to ensure that these revolutionary measures, quote, in which the people take part in the liturgy, end quote, would be everywhere promoted as a liturgical apostolate.
Yeah, that's Mediator Dei, paragraph 109. Continue, Anthony.
Here we see the first intimation of the theology of lay liturgical ministry, which would be later developed at Vatican II, whereby the whole assembly shares the responsibility for celebrating Mass. Thus, Pius XII effectively undermined his own teaching on the Catholic priesthood, found elsewhere in the same document. With such confusion between the ordained and the non-ordained, is there any wonder that there developed a crisis of priestly identity? Soon after issuing the encyclical, Pius XII appointed Father Bugnini to his commission for the general reform of the liturgy, which was staffed by a few hand-picked progressives, satraps.
Okay, footnote, the members of the commission in 1948 were Cardinal Clemente Micara, Pro-Prefect of the Sacred Congregation of the Rites, President, Father Annibale Bonini, Secretary, Monsignor Alfonso Carinci, Secretary of the Congregation of Rites, Father Augustin Bea. So Augustin Bea was bad news. S.J. Father Ferdinando Antonelli, OFM, Franciscan, bad news. Father Joseph Lowe, CSSR, that's Redemptorist. Dom Anselmo Albareda, St. Benedict, Prefect of the Vatican Library. So you have some modernists right in among them. So here's Pius XII, giving a huge pat on the back to Bugnini. Keep going, Bugnini. And this little rat, I don't know what he was doing. I don't know what he was up to, but he either had Pius XII really fooled, or Pius XII was too weak to put an end to his shenanigans. Go on.
The first result of the Commission's work was the restructuring of the Easter Vigil Rite, 1951, with a view to promoting active participation, leading to an entire revision of the Holy Week liturgy in 1955. This, in turn, would spawn all the subsequent liturgical reforms up to and after Vatican II, with the same rationale in mind. There was no doubt in the minds of the two most influential members of the Commission, Fathers Bugnini and Antonelli, that the reforms they devised in the 1950s were based on the same principles as the post-conciliar reforms. Bugnini made several statements to the effect that the 1955 reforms were a transitional stage of a more general liturgical reform, quote, the first step toward measures of a wider scope, end quote, and, quote, an arrow, end quote, pointing forward. Father Antonelli stated that his early attempts at revision of the Roman Rite under Pius XII were simply a quote-unquote kind of novitiate for the official reforms of Vatican II and later. He stated that the 1956 Holy Week reforms contained the quote criteria which would inspire the future reform of the liturgy, end quote.
Okay, so what's the mindset of Antonelli, of Bugnini? What's their mindset with the 55 reforms?
It's just a stepping block.
Yeah, it's the camel's nose in the tent. There's a lot more to come. But Pius XII, maybe he wasn't, I don't know. Again, I think he lost clarity of vision, strength, and grace because he didn't. I mean, it's obvious. To me, it's obvious. Because our heaven demanded this, and he refused. And he went to his grave saying no to Our Lady. So, some argue that he did a private consecration of Russia with a group of Russian people. But that's not what Our Lady asked. She asked with all the bishops of the world. So, this is very important quotations right here. Because Bugnini says it's the first step towards measures of a wider scope. In other words, the 55 reforms were the first step of 7 stages to the new Mass. It's out of his own mouth. So this rat, this Freemason, in Antonelli, he was quoted, I think he was quoted in...
He's quoted by Father Cicada.
Yeah.
That every
little rubric in prayer bears a theological significance.
Yes, conveys a theological concept.
Yes. So they weren't stupid, these Bugnini and Antonelli. They weren't stupid. They were very intelligent. And that's why, I wonder if they worded things different with Pius XII. Said one thing and did another, like the Pharisees. Yes?
Father, are we allowed to mark things with pencils?
Yes, go ahead. When Bugnini's chickens came home to roost, chickens. Well, go ahead, Gabriel.
How ironic that Father Antonelli, who had been given chief responsibility on Pius XII's commission for the reform of Holy Week, later deplored the outcome of what the commission had initiated in the 1950s. In his memoirs, he noted, quote, many of those who have influenced the reform and others have no love and no veneration of that which has been handed down to us. They begin by despising everything that is actually there. This negative mentality is unjust and pernicious. With this mentality, they have only been able to demolish and not to restore.
Yes, so he's saying, probably Bugnini among them, many of them just hated the Catholic practices from the beginning. Footnote, this is not to suggest that Cardinal Antonelli wanted to preserve intact the Church's liturgical tradition. He was secretary for the Liturgical Commission of the Second Vatican Council, a member of the Post-Conciliar Concilium, and became secretary of the Sacred Congregation of Rites in 1965. Okay, we'll pick up next time. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.